My name is Haley Kurtz, and I will be presenting the topic of education of slaves and freed blacks prior to the Civil War. Although there is no definite start date, as slavery has been around for thousands of years, my topic ends at the start of the Civil War, which started in 1861. Before I get into explaining details about my topic, I would like everyone to consider the time frame my topic took place and how the access to education has changed since then. And I would also like everyone to consider what you think African Americans did in response to trying to have an access to education. The education of enslaved African Americans was basically non-existent, and African Americans who happened to be freed faced many challenges and had to jump through many loops just to obtain an education. Did you know that due to the fear of rebellion in slaves, in many states there were laws that prohibited the education of slaves, as they did not want slaves to become too knowledgeable and start revolts against their owners? Slave owners feared that through reading, slaves would read things from abolitionists or learn about the Underground Railroad, where thousands of slaves escaped, and be inspired to try to do the same thing. Anti-literacy laws were also passed in order to keep African Americans from receiving an education. Between the years of 1740 and 1834, many states in the South passed these anti-literacy laws with very harsh sentences. For example, in 1829, Georgia prohibited teaching African Americans to read, punished by fine and imprisonment. In 1832, Alabama and Virginia prohibited whites from teaching African Americans to read or write, punished by fines and floggings. And in 1833, Georgia prohibited African Americans from working in reading or writing jobs and prohibited teaching African Americans, punished by fines and whippings. The photo above shows a piece out of a newspaper in 1839 that is explaining the anti-literacy laws in Virginia and Louisiana, and states the penalty for breaking these laws. Now, this photo shown on the video shows a North Carolina law that is an example of an anti-literacy law passed, and the punishment if someone was caught teaching a slave to read or write. Now, I'm not sure if you guys are able to see the picture from where you're sitting, but in this example, if it was a freed African American teaching a slave to read, they would be punished with 39 lashes or imprisonment, but if it was a white offender, they would be punished with a $200 fine. Even the sentences were not equal. Now, this is a photo of Margaret Crittenden Douglas, who was imprisoned for 1 month in the common jail of Norfolk under the laws of Virginia for the crime of teaching free African American children to read in 1854. Now, overall, these anti-literacy laws demonstrate how the access of education and the idea of justice was not always fair to all members of society, as there were laws restricting one specific race on obtaining an education, which we know now was clearly not fair. In today's society, we now have laws put into place which mandate that all children must be given the opportunity to an education, but society during my topic did not have these standards, which shows how unjust society was towards slaves and African Americans, as they were not allowed to receive an education. And if they did receive an education, they had to go through many obstacles to get one. At the start of this presentation, I asked you to consider what you think African Americans did in response to trying to have an access to education, and I'd like you all to reflect on that for a moment. Although slaves and freed slaves faced many challenges with receiving an education, it does not mean they give up or that none of them received an education because they did. For example, in 1961, they found 4,000 African Americans in schools in states that were considered slave states. Many of the freed slaves who were able to obtain a higher education did so through the American Colonization Society. The American Colonization Society was formed in 1817 with the goal to send free African Americans to Africa. However, those who were educated often became the doctors, teachers, or lawyers which were needed for this colony. This is a map of Liberia produced or acquired by the American Colonization Society in their efforts to settle free African Americans in West Africa. This map shows natural features on the west coast of Africa and locations of native peoples, colonist towns, and mission stations. Another example that shows how the access of education has not been fair or just to all members of society is a Roberts versus City of Boston case in 1850. Which said that separate but equal schools did not violate the rights of African American children. However, we now know that separate is in fact not equal at all. This case took place in Boston, Massachusetts, and is based off a 5-year-old African American girl named Sarah C. Roberts. Sarah Roberts attended an all-black school that was very underfunded and extremely far away from her home. Due to the fact that Sarah Roberts passed 5 primary schools on the way to her school, her father, Benjamin F. Roberts, attempted to enroll her in an all-white school as it was significantly closer. However, due to Sarah's race, she was denied access, which was where this case originated. Because of the decision of Roberts versus City of Boston that states separate but equal schools did not violate any rights, white children were also served with more opportunities, as all black schools tended to be underfunded, overcrowded, and typically had poor conditions. This demonstrates how justice and the access of education before the Civil War was definitely favoring white children, as there were many obstacles that African Americans had to achieve just to receive an education strictly because of their race. This image appeared in an anti-slavery almanac in 1839, which featured the basis of the Roberts versus City of Boston case, as the title states how African Americans were being excluded from schools. Thank you guys for watching.